Hi everybody, Adam here. So today I want to talk about the forgetting curve, aka sort of the science behind why we forget things. And this is of course especially of great importance to me as I am of course a forgetful himbo who is always forgetting things, always trying to remember things. And wouldn't it be amazing if we all lived in a world in which we could remember everything all of the time? So by studying how the forgetting curve works, we can understand, okay, how can I supercharge my memory? How can I ensure that I basically never forget anything ever again? And again, that is a really cool superpower to have. So before we get started, don't hesitate to smash that like button, help level up the channel, and of course, help bless all himbos everywhere around the world with perfect recall and wondrous, wondrous, beautiful memories. Does this make them less of a himbo? Does this make me less of a himbo? I don't know. I am not here to talk about philosophy today. Aside from that, don't forget that I am generally accepting new online fitness coaching clients. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to reach out via the link below and I will be in touch with you pretty soon. So the forgetting curve is more properly called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve after this guy, Hermann Ebbinghaus, who, basically did a lot of research into human memory and just basically, why we forget things and how quickly that tends to happen. So he went under a personal experiment in which he attempted to memorize a lot of basically junk data, pointless syllables that he had invented and things like that. And then he basically just, tried to recall them at various points regularly and kind of recorded all of that data to get a sense of, okay, how often, how quickly do you forget things? As a result, he compiled all of his findings and he created a graph, which is a curve, which you can see here, which is then called the forgetting curve. It is a graph of basically how quickly we tend to forget things. What this research shows is that typically, once we learn something, it stays there, but then it very quickly starts to fall out of our minds. Within the first few days and weeks, we can have like half to a third to, even less recall. It very quickly drops off unless we're doing something to basically, reinforce that memory and get it stuck in our brains. Certainly, of course, there are some kinds of memories that are going to stick better than others. And this could be stuff like important events in our lives. But when it comes to things like, say, your credit card number or your phone number or, a random word in French, it takes a bit longer. And actually, it's not impossible to remember those things pretty well, but you have to do so by repeatedly remembering them and repeatedly looking them up over time, and then getting to the point where, that repeated effort actually then ingrains it in your memory. If we regularly recall and reuse that information through the process of what is called spaced repetition, which is to say that you're repeating it regularly over time after a little bit of a break, then we mentally refresh that memory. And it basically, we restart that forgetting curve. So, the best thing to do to ensure that you're not forgetting anything is simply to be reviewing it pretty regularly so that it never really has time to completely drop off. Even better, each time we refresh that forgetting curve, it drops off a little bit slower in the future. So it takes a little bit longer before it really starts to fall off. And so this is the whole point of why we repeat things. Why we repeatedly, look at flashcards to memorize words, why we have to regularly do exercises and studying and revising and so on with our academic classes so that we can remember what we've learned. Testing is another important way of doing this as well. Testing is a pretty active way of recalling things. It's basically like, okay, you're being asked a bunch of questions, you're being asked to apply the knowledge that you have. That forces you both to remember it, to recall it, and to also make use of it. So how can we ensure that we're basically never forgetting anything? The answer is to use a spaced repetition flashcard system to ensure that we are constantly reviewing the bits of information that we've learned. Basically, you write something down on a flashcard, you then use that as a study tool, and you review that flashcard periodically. That's just one little bit of information that you can then regularly refresh and keep fresh in your memory, and over time it is going to stick more and more until it becomes pretty well ingrained. In the olden days, this used to be something that we had to do by hand, and that was a pretty arduous and time-consuming process. Nowadays, we have lots of apps. The most popular, and the one that I use myself, is called Anki, A-N-K-I, which is a flashcard app that is incredibly easy to use, incredibly easy to make your own flashcards in. And then what you do is, again, you just review those flashcards over time. And the cool thing about an app like Anki is that it also then has a lot of data. It really, memorizes basically, how often you've gotten a card right versus how often you've gotten it wrong. And it can then adjust the spacing of those repetitions to ensure that you're being shown them at an optimal time span. So, of course, if you're having an easy time remembering a certain card, it will show it to you less frequently. But if you're having a hard time remembering a certain card, it will show it to you more frequently. And in this way, the spacing in that spaced repetition is done specifically in such a way that you are getting the most out of it, and that you are actually going to be able to remember pretty much everything once you're able to review those flashcards enough times. This is also a method that, is really highly backed up by the research. It's a method that's used by a lot of, what you would call like the memory athletes, I guess, like the people who do these sorts of competitions where they just have to know a lot of, cool little facts or whatever the case is. Those kinds of people tend to use flashcards, systems like Anki, because they are so convenient, so easy to use, and they are so good at helping you to retain things in your memory. Now, this does all sound like quite a lot of work, especially if you are a huge himbo like me. I remember very clearly that I once had a class in high school. It was something, I think it was called Study Methods or something like that. And essentially what the class was about was supposed to be trying to teach you how to be a good student, how to actually be good at, taking your tests and memorizing things and doing well in your classes and so on. And of course, it was not a class that, was like something that we had to take off, and it was just like a little elective thing that you had to do, like very intermittently. And of course, I remember I must have been 10, 11, 12 years old, and this teacher was telling me like, oh yeah, you've got to, keep reviewing all this stuff. And I'm sitting there like thinking like, you mean I've got to review this stuff? Like, after I'm already done with the history test, after I've already gotten the grades that I'm going to get on it, you're saying that you want me to keep looking at this stuff over and over again? That sounds like a lot of work. That sounds like something I don't care about. Like, why would I want to do that? That sounds awful. That sounds like, just a treadmill of like learning the same facts over and over again. And the reality is that, yes, that is kind of true, but also like my teacher was 100% correct. Like, they were telling me like a secret, like a magical method that it would take me, 2 decades afterwards to internalize and to actually make use of. Today, it is one of the most important methods that I am using all the time because one of my hobbies is learning new languages now. And that means that if I want to actually be able to remember the words that I'm learning, I do have to review them pretty regularly. And especially when it comes to words that are maybe less common, you're not going to as frequently encounter them if you're just reading in the target language. Then yeah, it becomes absolutely necessary to review flashcards regularly to get those words ingrained into my memory. And it does get quite a lot easier. Like, again, it may sound like, oh, I'm just doing the same stuff over and over again. But the reality is that once you know a certain word well enough, in Anki, for example, it may get to the point where it's like, okay, the next time you're going to see this flashcard is a year from now. It's going to be 2 years from now. After a certain point, it gets a lot easier because things get so ingrained in your memory that the forgetting curve, basically becomes very, very slow. It's not going to be a huge issue. So while initially it may seem like daunting, the amount of stuff that you have to review, the amount of, times that you have to review things, it becomes a lot less over time simply because stuff gets ingrained in your memory. It gets a lot easier. You don't have to worry about it. And when you hit that point, you start to feel weird when you're not getting in your practice. You start to be like, oh man, like I entirely missed this. It was such a normal part of my life to be reviewing this information. And now I feel like I'm, moving backwards, or I feel like I'm not actually doing the practice that I'm supposed to be doing. That does become, again, it just becomes like a part, like a second nature sort of thing. It becomes a part of you. It becomes a part of your identity. You enjoy doing that practice because you care about the stuff that you're learning. And in case you were wondering, hey, is Adam ever going to bring this back around to lifting weights somehow? The answer is yes, of course, because I almost always try and find some way to do that. Because the reality is that basically any skill that you learn, it's the same. the forgetting curve is not just a thing that applies to, memorizing facts or memorizing words in a different language. It also applies to physical skills that you learn, like say, playing the guitar, riding a bicycle, playing the trumpet, and so on. It's also going to apply to things like lifting weights. If you are not giving your body regular stimulus in the form of lifted weights, then you're going to start losing the strength and muscle gains that you have built. Of course, it takes less effort to maintain over the long run. And so, even a relatively small amount of practice can go a very long way. And that is exactly what we are doing when we are doing flashcards. We're doing that small amount of practice that goes a long way towards maintaining a skill. Certainly, you can put a lot more, effort into really doing like focused targeted practice to really develop a skill. But in the long run, you're going to need to be doing something to maintain that skill, to prevent it from falling off, to prevent that forgetting curve from leading you to forget everything. And that is precisely what practice is. Practice in the form of spaced repetition for flashcards, in the form of continuing to play the guitar, in the form of continuing to lift weights over time, that is what is going to make you good. That is what is going to enable you to retain that memory, retain that skill, retain that ability for as long as possible until eventually death comes for us all, which is, the sad truth. Who knows? Again, I am an immortal gains vampire who is at least a few thousand years old, so maybe death will not come for me. Death will probably come for you, you foolish, silly, little mortal human beings. So the takeaway from today's video is, of course, if you care about some skill, if you care about some memory, you are going to be spending time to practice it. Practice it over time. Spaced repetition. That's all I'm just going to shout spaced repetition over and over again until some people actually do it. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's video. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you are going to turn off this video and you are promptly going to forget what the forgetting curve is. Is that irony? I don't know, because I am a himbo. Anyway, have a great week, all of you. If you like this video, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe. Comment down below. Let me know what you want to see in future videos and all those other wonderful things that you do. I will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.